Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone. And now, here is your host, the lovely, delightful, insightful, and all-around great gal, Ms. Barbara DeLong.
Hello and welcome to Nightlight, everybody. I am really excited about today's show. I have an amazing guest who has not yet called in but is on his way to calling in. So I want to tell you a little bit about Hugh Newman before he arrives. He's an explorer, a megalithomaniac, an author of Earth Grids, The Secret Pattern of Gaia's Sacred Sites, co-author of Giants on Record, and his new book is called Stone Circles. He's a regular guest on History Channel's Ancient Aliens and Search for the Lost Giants. He has articles published in Atlantis Rising, which is a U.S. magazine, New Dawn, which is an Australian magazine, and numerous other publications. As well as organizing the Megalithomania Conference and tours, he's spoken at events in the UK, Malta, France, Peru, Egypt, Bosnia, and North America. He lives in Glastonbury, England. So, we have to give him a little bit of time. I just got the flash that he was at least online. So I'm pretty sure he's trying to figure out how to get in. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Patrick and I met him in 2011 at a Megalithomania conference. And that was a conference that we presented our documentary, Secrets of the Stones. I have to tell you, these conferences are probably one of the most exciting things I've ever been to. It had a plethora of amazing people who are involved in the megaliths around the world, and the more that we hear about all of the research that all of these people are doing, the more we become aware of how little we truly know about the Earth's history. It to me is mind blowing and staggering. The information that it's not so much that it's been withheld, although I sometimes think there is that element of it, especially when it comes to the giants and the little people and all of those guys. But it just, to me, is amazing that these structures have been there forever, and we really, really, really don't know anything about them. When you look at the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau, it's been standing there for thousands and thousands of years, and the debate is now, amazing. Is it 12,000 years old? Is it 50,000 years old? And then it's like, holy mackerel, nobody really knows. Okay, so welcome to the show, Hugh. I was running out of banter.
Good timing, then. Good timing.
Absolutely. I was talking about the two books that you've written, which I have read. And I have to tell you that the Stone Circle book especially fascinated me in that they're not only just in England, but they're all over the world. And people aren't paying attention to them. I think my biggest complaint here is that there are so many hints of antiquity that we are ignoring and then just knocking down without paying attention to them and trying to learn what they mean and where they came from.
No, I agree. I agree. I think that's one of the big oversights of just megalithic culture in general, but especially stone circles, is the fact that they seem to be everywhere. And they date back to a much earlier age than people realize. Even examples in North America, up in New England, potentially. And so, yeah, I think it's one of those universal symbols that people, obviously work with the circle. But the earliest examples really go back to like 12,000 years ago at Göbekli Tepe, an amazing site in southeast Turkey. But yeah, often many of them in Britain, some of them are small and other countries, so they get destroyed, they get built over, people forget about them and just take them for granted. So it's one of the issues.
Well, Göbekli Tepe is fascinating in that, to my knowledge, that it was at one point intentionally covered up and then dug up again.
That's right.
So,
yeah, originally it was built around 12,000 years ago, and there were multiple circular arrangements of freestanding stones with these T-shaped pillars, often mainly with two in the center as well. And they had a retaining wall kind of holding the pillars in place, but they were just rested really on the bedrock in very shallow pits. And then they would cover them up and then build another one on top of it over and over again over this whole area. So there's potentially between 40 and 50 of these so-called stone circles that were then completely covered up about 10,000 years ago, after about just less than 2,000 years of use. So then it was completely buried. It was all reconstructed, then buried 10,000 years ago and completely forgotten about until 1996. Or I think actually in the 1960s, there was the first idea that there might be something there was reported, but it wasn't dug up until 1996 by Klaus Schmidt and the German Archaeological Institute. So that, the fact that it was forgotten for so long, and it was also preserved as well. So we have this wonderful preservation of the beautiful carvings and style of the site, which somehow retained itself because it was deliberately covered up so long ago.
And they have no idea as to what the purpose of it was, though.
There's no confirmed purpose of it. It's still the same with most stone circles, to be honest with you. But with Göbekli Tepe, there's so many kind of shamanic carvings. There's evidence potentially of astronomical alignments, which Andrew Collins has been working on with engineer Rodney Hale. And there's all these carvings of these different types of animals, which are very strange. And some of them, the way they're placed with this sort of strange abstract symbols, suggest they were marking movements of the night sky. So it could have been a very early astronomical temple, but it could have been something else. It could have been, there's absolutely no evidence of people living there. They didn't live anywhere near there. They lived a few miles away at the closest. But they know agriculture developed very close to that area. So it could have been an agricultural center where they could have even been charging the seeds there. They could have worked out a way of like developing this, working with earth energies and fertility. As one idea anyway that I've been sort of dwelling on for the last couple of years. But there's no confirmed use. What the archaeologists say is that it's a ritual site where the site is for ritual purposes. People will come in from different areas and carry out the rituals there. And there's also not many burials there. There's a few bones here and there, but no really large burials there. So it wasn't a burial site either particularly, although they have found evidence of feasting there with other animals as well. But yes, it's quite a strange site. It really is like an anomaly. It shouldn't be there. This was a time of so-called hunter-gatherers, and suddenly they have this highly artistic, very abstract art kind of designed into the site, and a very sophisticated stone technology as well. So yeah, it's one of those sites. I've been there a few times, and it just bewilders me. I think leave it like that.
It fascinated me because of all the stone circles, all over the world, you see rings of stones, and I guess Stonehenge is one of the few places where there is a structure there that comes close to kind of looking like Göbekli Tepe, but it's the T-shaped stones that I don't recall seeing any record of anyplace else.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, it does have a sort of slight resemblance to Stonehenge, but there is one other place I visited last year, about this time last year, is Menorca, which is one of the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean, and they have some Bronze Age enclosures, quite similar, a little bit similar to Göbekli Tepe, with these one large T-shaped pillar in the center and sometimes around the edge, but the difference in time is about 6,000 or 7,000 years between Göbekli Tepe and Menorca. And so that kind of intrigued me, very similar design, not exactly the same, not as sophisticated as Göbekli Tepe, but much later. So yeah, it's quite weird that you do find there are some similarities, but the amount of time between them is so large that you can't claim there's any connection between them.
Wow. I know one thing that you said in your book on circles that kind of caught my attention to something that I had read elsewhere. You suggested that possibly there was a world culture at some time, and that the stone circles were a part of a world culture, so that as time went by and people migrated to other areas, they took that knowledge with them and replicated it all over the world. Klaus Dona, I'm pretty sure you know of him if you don't know him. He does the out of place artifacts. He's found writing that it predates Sumerian, and he's found that all over the world as well. And he said the same thing, that at one time there may have been a global culture, not just separate individual places, but all one culture that then got fragmented and separated, I don't know, through a mass destruction or whatever. But it does kind of feel like that at one time maybe we were all one and then got separated. I don't know whether it was the shifting of the plates or what, but it does feel like at one time there was just one culture and that it was fragmented, and depending on where it ended up, it was evolved to the indigenous culture or the indigenous climate wherever it was. Is that a possibility?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of evidence of extreme similarities around the world. It's something many researchers, and myself included, have been looking at, which don't make any sense. I mean, obviously we've got the stone circles pretty much most areas, but you've also got things like dolmens, which we even get in New York State and New England, as well as all over the world. We have a very specific thing. There's something that the brilliant J.J. Ainsworth has been researching, looking at petroglyphs and symbols all over the world. And so you find some of them go so far back, even like before the time of Göbekli Tepe. And so we have to question what was going on. Was there movement around the world? Was there kind of a global culture? Obviously, the A word Atlantis pops up when we talk about this. And the idea people like Edgar Cayce and Plato and others have put forward is that there was even a landmass where this all came from. But I'm not 100% sure about that because I haven't found anywhere. But it seems like there was, at that time, at the end of the last ice age, some kind of global awareness of different countries and the building styles and certain anomalies around the world do seem to support that.
I mean, you've got, I think, the best job in the whole world going around and hitting all of these ancient sites and being able to get a feeling for the energy that they emit. And one of the newest things that I've noticed is that because of our technology, they're able to, first of all, ground penetrating radar is helping tremendously, and then our ability to to test frequencies. I know that there was mention that you had been to Bosnia and worked with Dr. Sam on the Bosnian Pyramid for a while.
Yes, I did go to Bosnia to look at the hills there in 2011. Unfortunately, after spending a week there looking around, we didn't see anything that looked like actual pyramids or anything particularly prehistoric or anything like that. So that's a bit of a I can't really comment any more on that, but we didn't see anything there that confirmed anything to us, so we didn't continue with any research on that.
Yeah, well, they have run into problems with the government, I understand, in being able to actually excavate anything. So that is probably something for the future to look into. I know that you've spent time on the Giza Plateau. You've certainly been to Puma Punka. You've been to your book, the Stone Circles. You did a tremendous amount of work. You must have spent a long time on this book, because you have isolated and you have pinpointed them all over the place. And the ones that I am most interested in are the Avery
yes.
ones. I've done some reading on it and spoken to some people that have been there, and I mean, you chronicle it beautifully. The one thing that I've heard people say is that they literally can put their backs to the stones and feel the energy. Did you ever experience that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very energetic spot, Avery, even though it's been turned into like a village with a church and a pub and everything inside it with main roads going through it. It's still got some energy there. Surprisingly, even Stonehenge has at certain times, and other places that seem to be kind of, modernized. But one of the things about Avebury, which is potentially why it's energized, is number one, it's on the Michael and Mary energy lines, which stretch all the way across southern, and it's a sort of chalk ridge, so you get a lot of underground water and therefore electric charge moving through the land there. And all the stones are very lightly magnetic. They're sort of sarsen stones from relatively local area, but they're all magnetically oriented to each other in the circle and down the avenues, as though the people who built it understood magnetism and understood how to kind of move, sort of align magnetic-oriented stones to one another. And there must have been a purpose for that, because it would have been incredibly difficult. It's almost impossible to do that by chance. Literally, 1,000,000 to 1 chance you could do that. So they deliberately did that. Therefore, they're working with the magnetism, so you would get an energy thing. And that would, if you charge it up somehow, maybe with ceremony, ritual, and various other, magic and things like this, you would get some kind of energy system. And I think they were working with the natural earth energies, the underground water. They had sorcerers with them and all this kind of stuff. So you would have an effect. And the fact that these stones are also crystalline is another aspect, which absorb information, memory, and things like this, and charge. And so you could most certainly, it makes sense that these are energetic sites.
Oh, absolutely. And now, how are the stone circles usually, built over water or running water, or I mean, it just seems to me that these sites are situated at energetic, as you said, at magnetic at points. So they would have had no way of being able to. Well, obviously they had a way, but how did they identify these spots?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the ideas that some people have come up with, which I kind of agree with, is the fact that people were super sensitive back then. I think there was no distraction. The only thing they had was the sky and landscape to work with. There was no distraction. There's hardly any people. There's no TV. There's no background noise. There's no artificial light. So they were working with the stars, the sun, and the moon, and also the land. And they were just naturally tuned in, much more intuitive, because they could be, because they had nothing else to do. They would just sit under a stone or a tree and observe for days on end. And they would probably sense energies as they walked through certain areas. They would also probably see natural earth lights, which do occur in quite only really nowadays in remote places, because you can't see them anyway because of all the artificial light. And so they would probably observe what occurrences were happening, and realize that maybe they might have deemed that a sacred place and then built upon that accordingly. And also they were obviously like geomancers and dowsers, because number one, they had to find underground water to survive.
Right.
They had to use the natural earth energies for fertility purposes, to charge up seeds. It's the work of John Burke and others. And also to be in a safe space, away from, prowling wolves and beasts that would probably come after them. So there's different aspects to consider, like just practical things really, when you think about it. But naturally, I just think they were much more intuitive and could sense things in a much more profound way than we can nowadays.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense, and the dowsing is probably something that did go on, and it probably wasn't called dowsing, but I would imagine that there were people who were able to sense and feel the earth energy. I know that a lot of the monasteries and a lot of the churches have been built along the grid, the earth grids, and so that there has to have been a way to determine where to place these structures. The stone circles, especially the ones in Great Britain, because they seem to be larger than any place else. At least that's what it seems here, and certainly Avery is a good example of that. And it horrifies me to think that these kind of circles may have been everywhere, and yet we just didn't understand what we were looking at, so that we knocked them down and bulldozed them out of the way and created patios out of them and stuff like that. It seems to me that it's so important to get the message out there to people that structures like this have great meaning, and there is a spiritual connection to them too, and that's what really upsets me, the fact that stone circles, crop circles, stone chambers all have a special spiritual feeling to them that can help to enhance our own abilities, and to destroy them takes away, portals that we could have used for our own evolution.
No, I agree. Yes. I think there's something much more profound than people may realize about these stone circles. There's actually strange stories mentioning like kind of portals. There's one story that I've come across. I can't find the original source for this. I'm not sure of its authenticity. Where a bunch of people, they went to Stonehenge. This is before they built all the fences and they had to pay to go in and things like that, back in the 50s or 60s probably. And a bunch of people camped in the stones. All this light phenomena was seen. Next thing you know, there's puffs of smoke, and half the people have disappeared, and the other half are running away screaming. So I can't find the source of that, but it's like literally people are sort of disappeared in stone circles. So that would suggest something quite strange and bizarre. I think just the circular form as well, it does, represent that really. And so there could be something in that.
Well, it takes you back to sacred geometry too. And it's the circle it represents the whole. And you look at Mandela's, the circle represents the whole of the spirit. And you take a look at crop circles, and very much, they are usually circular in shape. Not always these days, but they started out that way. And when you look at especially the circles represent a whole. And in my experience, I've worked with sacred geometry with the cards that I did and stuff like that, so that the whole encompasses not only it encompasses the wholeness, but it also creates a doorway through which you can go if you have the energy and the strength and if you have the ability to connect to what is beyond that circle, that circle that has been defined. And it just, I know that there have been, obviously rituals that have been conducted there over the years. I'm wondering if the circles were there and then they decided to do the rituals in them, or if it was important for the rituals to have the stone circles. And I know there's no way to determine that.
Yes. It's like what came first, the stone circle or the crop circle or the ritual. But yeah, I understand. It's a strange. I mean, one of the ideas which is sort of touched upon there is the idea that when they first were deciding where to put stone circles, what may have occurred there first was a crop circle, and that's why they decided to build the stone circle there, because there was agriculture going on back in the Neolithic into the Bronze Age times. So they're growing crops. So there might have been crop circles appearing, and then they would then build something there to mark that sacred spot. And it kind of makes sense when you look at Avebury and Stonehenge, because there's so many crop circles appear right in this area, right next to these sites. It's quite bizarre. And so, but I think these sites were built to last as well. So they were used over and over again by different epochs, different generations of people with different religious and spiritual and ritualistic ideas. So they're getting constantly charged. And they never seem to go. They're always there. They're like immortal. They're like a symbol of our quest for immortality. And so I think there's more to them than people realize.
Oh, I totally agree with you. And I think that when I read through the stone circles, I kept getting the feeling that these are monoliths. These are huge stones. And the people of the time, it would have been so difficult for them to place them the way that they're placed. And of course the theory of giants comes up here, and I know you and Jim Vieira wrote the book on giants, and I'm wondering, I guess it could be a possibility. There's no way of ever knowing, but they are so large that people of the time would have had such trouble erecting them and getting them to the sites, because Stonehenge, I believe some of the stones there, were where they came from was quite a distance away from where they were erected.
That's true, yeah. A lot of them came from very vast distances. If we just look at Stonehenge as an example, there's two types of stone there. There's the sarsen stone, which comes from about 20 miles away, and then there's the blue stones, the spotted dolerite, which comes from the Preseli Mountains in Wales. And there's actually a tradition at Stonehenge. I mean, incidentally, the first ever recorded name of Stonehenge was actually called the Giants' Dance, or the Giants. So slightly different variations on that. So this was recorded in the 11th century, 12th century, in the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and in the stories in there go back, talk lots and lots about giants. And one of the stories is that originally the stones that ended up in Stonehenge were brought by giants from North Africa over to a place called Killarus in Ireland, where they were constructed. They were there for thousands of years, and then during the 6th century, this doesn't really make sense in reality, but in the 6th century, King Ambrosius got Merlin to collect some stones from the Killarus in Ireland, and he used magical powers called gears to transport and levitate them over from Ireland to construct them on Salisbury Plain. So it's quite a strange, convoluted story that stretches over thousands of years about how and where these stones came from, but giants were involved in that original kind of story. And the fact that the Giants' Dance name was used up until the Saxons changed it to Stonehenge, which basically means hanging stones, does suggest there's some link with giants. Also, there's been a whole bunch of giant skeletons we've found in the area, reported going back over 1,000 years, up until about 300 years ago, where between 9-foot and 14-foot giants were unearthed within a few miles of Stonehenge, often within the mounds. And so, the book we're working on now, Jim and I we're slowly working on it. I've been sort of focused on the Stone Circles book, is Giants of Stonehenge in Ancient Britain, because we've got hundreds of accounts now all over Britain would suggest the same phenomena was happening here as it was in North America, which is the focus of our previous book. And also the earliest pictorial depiction of Stonehenge was again in the 12th century by a poet called Robert Wace in his version of the History of the Kings of Britain, and it shows something like a 14, 15-foot giant lifting a lintel, one of the sort of horizontal stones, into place at Stonehenge, with Merlin and some other guy, probably King Ambrosius, advising him, guiding him about where to put it. And so you do get these stories. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg. All over the country, in Britain, we have very strong traditions, very strong folklore that was very strongly in the consciousness of people, going back thousands of years potentially. And then you have to, how they actually moved the stones, as you mentioned a minute ago. Perhaps they hired the local giants to do the heavy lifting and quarrying. This is something. It sounds strange, but I've got a feeling that's how it was. Yeah.
Well,
it's like go on.
Yeah. No, I was wondering if you were familiar with the Vayner cave in Bavaria.
No, I don't know about that. No.
Vayner cave in Bavaria. They have records. In 1535, a group of the local men went into a cave there, and they found massive bones of giants, just massive bones, and it was there's a writing of the entire journey in the archives in Bavaria that tells the entire story of their journey into this mountain and the bones and everything else. And in 76, an explorer went in and to document it. He found that there was very little still there, but there were still bones there. And then in let me see, in 1792 somebody went in, and then there was a combat photographer that went in, and his name was Danny, I forget the last name. Anyhow, he went in and filmed it, and he brought out some bones, and they were dated way back. So and what's interesting is the location of the cave had been in World War II. There had been a concentration camp there. And Danny was in the military, and he went in because he had heard that there had been a concentration camp there, and that he wanted to see if he could get bones out to see if they could DNA identify them to notify people, that here's the remains of your whatever. And they found even more ancient bones there as well, and the place was full of bones. And they did bring some bones out, but what happened was that it was a NATO encampment that Danny was connected to, and they were using the cave. It was in a range where they were doing live testing of bombs and stuff, almost as though they were intentionally trying to cover the cave up. But the cave was definitely there, and it's something you might want to look into because it looked very fascinating. And I know Patrick was constantly trying to get somebody else to go in, and he just passed away, and there wasn't time to do it. But the bones there, they said you could put one of the skulls over your head. They were that big, so they must have been huge. So the video that Danny did is on my website. If you want to check that out, they did videotape their journey into the cave. So but yeah, the giants fascinate me, but I want to get back to the circles. Have you ever done any ground penetrating radar on any of these sites?
No, not personally. No, I know you have to be a trained archaeologist to do that kind of thing. But there has been some I keep an eye on, especially in I live near Stonehenge now, so I keep an eye on the local landscape, what's going on around this area, and they keep finding things and they're pushing the dates back further and further. I was just in the Amesbury History Centre today, which is the local town to Stonehenge, and they were telling me that recently they found yet more evidence at a site called Blick Mead, which pushes the date. They've done some ground testing here, and they're now pushing the date back to over 10,000 years of continuous occupation up until when Stonehenge was used. It's incredible. It's the oldest, the oldest settlement in Britain, continuously used. So it's strange that I'm sort of living within that. It's quite odd. But yeah, I think more research is being done. I think stone circles are being taken seriously. I mean, the best research done on them really was by Alexander Thom, who was Oxford-trained Scottish engineer, who was a lecturer at Oxford University, and he went around about 300 stone circles over decades of time, recording their shape, size, and their astronomy really accurately, and realized the ancients were using a specific measurement system, what you call the megalithic yard, which is 2.72 feet. And also they're very advanced with astronomy and geometry. And so it wasn't just a random selection of stones in a circle. But one of the things they found with like Stonehenge and Avebury and other sites, for instance, is they found lots of evidence of compacted ground. So this suggests that there was like dances, there was a lot of people in ancient times visiting these places, and rituals and ceremonies and things like this going on at these sites. So we know that the ground penetrating radar has revealed things like that, which is quite intriguing in itself.
Well, now I've not been to Stonehenge, but is it on a mound, or is it on flat level ground?
It's not flat level ground. It's on a slope, actually. It's quite strange. It's on a slight slope, but it's actually level flat at the top of it. So it's quite strange why they've chosen that spot. But for some reason, that was the best spot. Probably the astronomy and the energy there. It's not really on a mound. No, there are lots of mounds around it. There's like over 100 mounds in the surrounding area that were made. Some of them are ancient, the long barrows, but most of the round barrows are Bronze Age, which would have been a few hundred up to 700 years later. Some of them, but this is where some of the giants were found. Actually. So it's quite bizarre.
Isn't there I may be misquoting, but isn't there a thought that perhaps there might be a burial of some sort at Stonehenge?
There are stories about burials. I mean, they did find some bones and skeletons actually in the ditch, the henge around, which is the circular ditch around the stone circle. But they think they were maybe later. They could have been a sacrifice, some people say. But it doesn't seem like it was technically the actual site was a burial place. But all the mounds in the surrounding landscape were. That most of the Bronze Age mounds are burial mounds. And they found some amazing things in there. They found very tall skeletons, even the bush barrow lozenge and the gold that was found, which is just over the road from Stonehenge, which is part of the main complex. They found quite a tall skeleton in there with beautiful jewelry and these sort of golden lozenge breastplates. And so, there's a lot of burials going on around it, but I don't think that was its original purpose. I think it had a much more meaningful purpose than that.
Well, it just, to me, the mounds here in the United States, that were when they started to dig them up and they discovered that they were burials, they took the artifacts and they got rid of the bones. And it's just before you came on, I was telling people how horrified I was that as far as preserving these bones and these artifacts, that we haven't done that. They've been taken as oddities. People have used them for doorstops and then they've disappeared. And it horrifies me to think that we have destroyed a part of our history that is so very important, at least in Great Britain. In the UK, there has been something of an understanding that this is part of history and we need to preserve it, and that's not the case here. But you've mentioned a couple of times the magnetic anomalies, and in a lot of the stone chambers here in the Northeast, there are magnetic anomalies that are in the entrances to some of the chambers. How do they do that? How do they create those magnetic anomalies?
Well, I think most of them are natural anomalies, which they probably observed by, spending time there. You'd also get with these, especially a negative magnetic anomaly, you get sometimes earth lights associated with it. One of the things John Burke came up with was the fact that these anomalies are often right upon what's called a conductivity discontinuity, where two types of geology meet, and the telluric current and the underground water move through these different media. They actually shift in between magnetic and electric, and often you get balls of light occur on the surface where this happens. So yeah, they probably spotted it by seeing strange lights sort of shimmering at that particular spot. I realised that's where that's where the energy is coming up. That's where we're going to trap the energy. So we build the entrance there. So all the energy gets trapped inside there, and that's where you place your seeds. That's where you sit and meditate to get altered states, and so on and so forth. And I think that's evident all over the world. I think it was just one of those almost like a technology that that people were working with back then. And I think if you actually think about it and meditate on it, you realize that that's what people would do probably. If that's all they've got to work with, they're going to work with whatever natural energies, natural phenomena they can, and try and harness that for themselves. And I believe they were shamanic cultures. If they had an altered state or some kind of experience with their mind altering, at these particular spots, they would think this is a sacred spot. We must do something. We must mark this. We must work. We must stay here and work with this energy or whatever you want to call it. And so I think that was the point to a lot of what they were doing.
Well, that makes perfect sense, because when you think about it, I mean, today to walk out at nighttime, you have glowing from the house lights, you have street lights, you have all sorts of things going on. You don't have perfect darkness. But back then, when there wasn't electricity, when there wasn't the technology there is today, you had perfect darkness, except for, of course, the lights in the sky. So that being able to detect glows from the ground or any of that would have been far easier than it is today. And that makes perfect sense. If I saw something coming up out of the ground like that, I would be inclined to want to, once I realized it wasn't going to hurt me, I would probably want to encompass it or trap it somehow. And I know in the chambers, they say that, seed that has been left in the chambers for a certain amount of time has greater abundance when it's planted, and it stores things and it preserves things, so that it would make great sense that just from seeing that happen would make it almost a magical place. And probably I would have done the same thing. I would have tried to trap it, But the stone circles, to me, and in lots of places there are, Avery especially. It has. I mean, for people. Well, first of all, let me go back to your book, because it's called Stone Circles. It's by Hugh Newman, and it's by Wooden Books. It is an amazing collection of the stone circles with amazing graphics in it, and you've done a phenomenal job here. I'm very impressed with the amount of material that you have in here, and you make it simple, so that you can grasp what's being said, and it triggers, I think, in consciousness in many cases, hidden memories in people's consciousness that it's like, that makes sense. It's not so long that you get bogged down, and yet you give amazing information here. Also, I wanted to take it back to the ley lines, which figure into the grid patterns, which, of course, was your other book. But I highly recommend both these books because they are an amazing wealth of knowledge put into a very small package that will open you up to wondering and then going around looking for stone circles for sure. In Great Britain, you're lucky in that you've got so many stone circles in so many places that it's obvious that something is there. Here in this country, I don't know. Are there any stone circles still standing here in North America?
There are a couple. I mean, one of them is the Burnt Hill Stone Circle in Massachusetts. It's on private land, unfortunately, so we've never been able to access it. But Jim and I are working on that. There's another one in a place. I forget. I think it's the New Hampshire. Where is it? It's called the Druids Hill Stone Circle. Let me just check the books. I've completely forgotten.
Is that in American Stonehenge? Is that?
It's not American Stonehenge, but it's not far from there. It's about an hour from there, maybe 45 minutes. Let me just check. Okay, no, I don't have full details on me, but the Druid Circle is near. I think it's a place called Pelham in New Hampshire. It's not too far from American Stonehenge, but it's kind of hard to find. It's actually in this park, this sort of state park where they've got kids play area there now. They've kind of reconstructed it, but interestingly, it's on the edge of this reservation. And the reservation, we know, were a certain tribe where giants resided there, and we feature that in the Giants on Record book. Actually, we have a little discussion about that because that's quite intriguing. That there's a potential sort of oval-shaped stone circle, and it's in the area where giants, may have been involved in its construction.
I know that in North America here, and I can only speak for New England because that's the extent of my travel and investigation in the monoliths. We have a lot of the balanced stones too, and those have survived. And they are remarkable in that they are huge stones that are balanced on tips that you can't knock over, because I did try. I know Patrick and I went to see several of them, and it was like, oh my gosh, that thing's got to come tumbling down in a heartbeat, and it was about as solid as it possibly could have been. And you begin to wonder, how do these things happen? I know with one of them, I actually even had a metal detector with me, and I thought, there have to be steel rods that are that are holding this in place, because it couldn't possibly maintain this balance without some sort of support. But there was no metal at all, and again, the giants come into play here.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a couple of those balanced rocks. They're very bizarre, the way they just somehow sit there just perfectly, and you can't really budge them. I kind of think they're really quite cool, actually. You don't get too many of those. You don't get too many of those in Britain, though. It's a very North American thing, I find. Obviously, in other parts of the world as well. But yeah, I think that's could be an indication of, is that just nature doing that, or is that extreme positioning, like trying to get it correct? Spending days trying to get it bang on. I mean, no one really knows.
Well, the one that we saw, I think it weighed as much as a locomotive, and it was resting on just the tip tip of the rock, and the whole thing, it was huge. And I said to Patrick, try to knock it over, and he wouldn't go near it. And I pushed, and it was, I was pretty sure I wasn't going to knock it over. And, he said, what happens if you knock it over? How do we get it back up? And I said, chances are I'm not going to knock this over, but I had to push. And, they feel so, giants had super glue or something, because I can't imagine that glacial anomaly would create something like that. It would seem to me that if a glacier was moving, that it would have shifted the stone off. It wouldn't have put it on. So, it's just, and for those of you, Google balanced rocks and hit images, because you'll see some phenomenal examples of things that I can't explain, and yet they're there, and you can walk around them, you can touch them. They're not protected. There are no gates around them. They're just sitting in state parks for the most part. But and again, the element of magnetic energy comes in here, and I'm wondering, because most of these rocks and most of the rocks that the stone chambers are made out of, and I'm not sure about the rocks, the standing stones, but they appear to, a lot of them here in this country anyhow, are granite. So what is the composition of the stones? Most of the stones that you have researched, are they granite, or are they slate, or are they sandstone? What's the composition of the stones themselves?
Well, you get a lot of variation, to be honest with you. For Stonehenge, for instance, is like a sarsen stone. It's like a type of sandstone, quite hardened sandstone. And then you get the spotted dolerite, which comes from the Preseli Mountains, which is like a blue, very crystalline stone. And then a lot of the sites obviously are granite, so you have very high level quartz, up to 55% quartz. And then you have, even the sarsens have very light magnetic effect. Other stones, like you get red sandstone, which you find in places like, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in South America, they have much more magnetic because they've got iron in them. And so you get different variations. And I think people, it got to a point where they were picking and choosing what stones they wanted, because they knew they could transport them from anywhere they wanted. But a lot of the sites just use the local stone that's available. So it depends really. Every type of stone has been used to create a stone circle. There's even like a white crystal stone circle in Cornwall, which I visited in January with a good friend, Sean Kerwin. I think it's called Billow Stone Circle. Billow, and it just glows white in the right light. It's pretty amazing. So you have all these different variations. So it's quite intriguing.
Yeah, because the stones here in New England, basically granite, and because they have the quartz crystal in it, and quartz crystal is good. It's a vibrational energy to it. It can be used for, as an empath, as a sensitive, anything with quartz in it, of course, resonates to you on a spiritual level. And I was just wondering if there was something that was, consistent, but it doesn't sound like it is. It sounds like it's, whatever is handy or within a couple 100 miles, they picked up. Do you get the feeling that any of the stones have been in any way formed? In other words, did they just stick a stone up, or did they carve it, or did they in any way alter its shape or size?
Yes, you certainly get that. Most of the stone circles in Britain are rough-hewn stones, so they're just stones they found pretty much as they were, and then placed them. But Stonehenge, you have these very neatly cut stones with mortise and tenon joints on the lintels and the top of the uprights. And so they were cutting and shaping these specifically, carving them, so that it was quite sophisticated, much like we find with the stone technology in Peru Peru and Egypt, there was extreme carving going on in a very sophisticated way. There are elements of that here, but only really, you don't get too many like that. It's mainly Stonehenge you get that. There is a small amount of evidence of some of that in Orkney, where with the sort of blade, like razor-like stones, very thin.
Yeah.
But they do form kind of naturally like that as well. And you get some kind of rounded stones that look like they may have been carved, or kind of polished in a certain way. But even the blue stones that came from Wales, Stonehenge, they've been cut and shaped because they're all uniform size, all within the inner kind of horseshoe shape, like the oval within the main stone circle. So I think that there are elements of that, but not too many in Britain. Whereas if you look at Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey again, every stone there is carved specifically, into these T shapes. They're like abstract human forms with belts and thin arms, very alien looking, very abstract art style. And every stone there has been carved. There's not one rough-hewn stone on the whole site. Thousands of stones there. And so we have to kind of question that, really. And I think there are a few examples around the world where there are some kind of stone carvings. I know there's, in Portugal, at Cromlech Almendres, there's carvings on the stones, like spirals and different shapes, and the shepherd's crook. We have examples of that in Britain. But most of the Brittany stones do appear to be mainly rough-hewn. But when you're getting into, the different aspects of the megalithic culture, I mean, one example is the Scottish stone spheres, hand sort of tennis ball-sized stone spheres that are carved out of all different types of rock into these geometric forms that are being found all over Aberdeenshire, up in Orkney. About 3 of them have been found in England, but mainly up in north east Scotland. And that proves they were able to carve and manipulate stone in a very precise, very geometric, precision way. So even though many of the circles that they were found near are rough-hewn stones, there's evidence that they were certainly working with stone. I mean, there's some examples of stone circles in Aberdeenshire. They're called the recumbent stone circles. Some of the main stones are lying on their lengthways. They look like some of those have been shaped. So there are examples like that. But Stonehenge is the ultimate stone circle because it's unique as well. There's nothing like Stonehenge in Britain apart from Stonehenge. Even though there's 1,000 recorded stone circles, it's the only one like that, with the lintels, with the precision carving, with different stone circles within different stone circles. So it really is quite unique and remarkable in its own right. Oh,
absolutely. When you are obviously a megalith, a maniac, and because you wrote that, I'm not coining it. It was in your bio on Amazon. But if you look at the stone megaliths around the world, you see the rough stones as you have in Great Britain, and then you see the stones like Giza and Teotihuacan, and then you see Pumapunka, which and Göbekli Tepe, Pumapunka even more so. And you see an evolution from the very rough to Pumapunka. For me, is the most precisely cut of all the stones, and I'm just going by the pictures I've seen. I don't know. I don't have personal experience of it, but it seems to me there was an evolution from the rough to what looks like it's laser or something like laser sharp edges. Is there am I right or wrong?
Yeah, no. In some cases you're right, but in other cases, the high level, the sophistication came first. This is what it's a bit of both. In England and Britain, you could probably see a development. Some places you can see that probably in Brittany as well. But when you go to Göbekli Tepe, it just came out of nowhere. Very sophisticated stonework, amazing style and construction, sophistication, 12,000 years ago. And in Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, There's very sophisticated stonework there, as you mentioned. But it could be that is the earliest. They're the earliest sites there. There's a big debate about this going on because they've recently been excavating Pumapunku, which I go there every year to sort of check things out, and we're heading back there in a few weeks actually. Is the fact that the more they dig, they realise there was some cataclysm that covered it all up, which must have been 10,000 years ago for that to happen. So it's a big question mark. So even the Inca, their stonework is not as good as the stonework that was there before them, which is the Viracocha Tiwanaku culture. So that's very strange in its own right. But I think, I've got to be honest with you, the best stonework I've seen, which is on par with Pumapunku, is in ancient Egypt. It is insane. I mean, I've just got back from there. I spent 3 weeks in Egypt with the Resonance Academy and Nassim Haramein and J.J. Ainsworth and the Kemet School. And the more you look deeply, especially into the ancient sites, the Giza Plateau and the Assyrian, the Abydos, it is incredible, the sophistication. Even up until late dynastic times, the stonework is remarkable, utterly remarkable. No one really understands how they did it unless they had computers and machine tooling.
Oh yeah, no, the hieroglyphs in some of the obelisks. Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's so precise. It's like it's been stamped in somehow, or I mean, it's so sharp you could almost cut your finger on it. It looks, and
yeah,
so. So I'm kind of, I know that you can't carbon date rock, which is too bad, and carbon dating apparently is not as good as one would have thought as far as the dating process goes. But I was just, really curious as to what was the earliest, how far back does it go, and then does it decline and then incline again and then decline? I mean, we're talking, 10,000 years. I think we got to be talking more like 30 or 40 or 50,000 years, to be honest with you.
That's just quite possible. There are some speculations about that, actually. There are some ideas floating around, because when you look at the Edfu building text and you look at the Abydos king lists, they talk about civilization going back 40,000 years just in Egypt, not in other areas, just in ancient Egypt. So you have to kind of question that. And then you have the dating done on the Sphinx enclosure, by Robert Schoch and John Anthony West and other people, where they found that the dating there could go back 10,000 years just by the weathering, which is very interesting in its own right. And if that's the case, then it's very likely the pyramids were built back then, possibly. But they've done some sonoluminescence dating on some of the pyramid stones, the casing stones of the lesser pyramids of the Giza Plateau, the granite, and in the Valley Temple, I believe, which give potential dates of only around 2,500 through to 3,000 BC. But this doesn't mean it's not conclusive, because they may have rebuilt the outer casing stones of the there. But even those dates are 500 years older than is accepted, so they weren't built by the pharaohs that were told built them. So that's really intriguing in its own way. But when you look at the Assyrian, which is like this underground megalithic temple, it looks a bit like Stonehenge, but much more sophisticated. It's so deep in the ground that they must have been built when it was ground level. So we're talking tens of thousands of years ago that was probably built. And that was completely covered up. I don't know if it was covered up deliberately. I think it was just had rubble and sand blown into it over the millennia. And that is remarkable. Some of the stones there weigh 200 tons. They have the polygonal, puffy style stonework like we find in Peru. But then again, so does the Giza Plateau. And so we have to question what's going on here. Not only have you got potentially extreme antiquity and very sophisticated stonework, you've got the styles, which are the same as you find in Peru, almost identical. And you cannot be dismissed how similar they are. So I really noticed that. I mean, I've been there a few times to Egypt, but I really noticed it on this trip, having spent sort of 3 weeks there investigating. And so, yeah, it's stunning. It's like, I think people overlook Egypt because there's so many sites there. It's such a vast civilization that lasted for several thousand years. But there's still deep anomalies there that have not been answered, that have not really been, fully answered. And it's causing a huge amount of controversy all around the world.
Well, they have done some ground penetrating radar in Giza, I know, and they found that there are tunnels and labyrinths underneath the plateau that they have yet to really investigate thoroughly. So
that's correct. Yeah, there's something called the Osiris Shaft. There's many tunnels between the pyramids. There's lots of underground water, obviously, but there's also what's Andrew Collins discovered, this huge cave complex, a natural cave complex that goes all beneath the pyramids. He wrote a book about it, in fact, as well. And so there's a lot more going on there, and I think there's clandestine activities going on there as well, where people are, very high level people are doing their own excavations, their own investigations, and so on and so forth, to see what they can find under the Giza Plateau. So
I understand.
yeah. So you got that.
Of course, it's secret. Nobody knows about it. So.
Yeah,
except it's going on.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
No. But I think the exciting part about all of this is that history books say, yeah, there are pyramids and, they were burial places for pharaohs and let's go on. And the reality is, no, they weren't. And when you even look at the Great Pyramid, there's no hieroglyphs. There's no, it wasn't a burial chamber. I'm not sure what it was. I know there's a sarcophagus in the king's chamber, but it just doesn't feel as though it was meant to be a burial place. The theories as to what it was actually for are as great as the stars in the sky, just about. But we have so much yet to learn from antiquity that it is mind-boggling, and the fact that there isn't enough focus on it really bothers me greatly, because it's our past, and if we don't understand our past, how can we have a future that is full of knowledge and wisdom?
Yeah, I think with the Giza Plateau, the Great Pyramid you mentioned is so strange. It's like it's after being inside it and going, and all around the outside of it as well, it just seems like it really does feel like you're walking into some huge machine. It doesn't feel like a temple. It doesn't feel like it's a palace or a temple or a tomb. It's got this whole other vibe going on with it, which I find very, very strange. And then there's the work that's been done by Chris Dunn and other researchers who pretty much proven that it could have acted as a machine to create energy, for different types of energy, absorbing seismic energy, telluric currents, earth energies, even downloading cosmic energy. And so, the jury's out as to its real purpose. But the fact is, it's so bizarre when every time I go to the Giza Plateau, when you just see those pyramids, you just cannot comprehend what the hell is going on here, because it's so they're so big. They're so precise. And you imagine what they look like with the casing stones on as well. Like the Great Pyramid would have had white, shiny limestone casing perfectly placed over the whole pyramid. It was almost like glow in the sunlight. It would dazzle you. The moonlight, it would dazzle you for miles around, with a gold capstone on top. And it was completely hermetically sealed. There was no way in. And there was no secret passages into it either. And then the other pyramids, the second pyramid, Khafre's pyramid, and then Menkare's pyramid, smaller ones, they were cased in granite. Incredibly, and the granite is puffy, polygonal style granite with all these little nodules on it, like little protrusions that are just like you find in Peru. So that alone, that much granite, which was transported 600 miles from Aswan, it's just bewildering when you imagine what it would have been: a white pyramid, possibly a black pyramid because it was like dark black granite, and then a red pyramid, which is red granite. So imagine seeing those things floating on the Giza Plateau, and it was all surrounded by water. All these water tunnels, and all the Sphinx and the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple were all filled with water potentially as well, and you could sail up to it from the Nile. And then they also found these huge Lebanese cedarwood boats on all different, just buried under the ground, completely buried like tombs. cedar wood boats that were seafaring boats of wood that came from Lebanon, going back 2,500 BC. So, oh God, it's such a mystery, that place. It just bewilders me.
Well, when Napoleon hit there, it was still covered by the casings. And apparently, Patrick found in the records someplace that the casings had hieroglyphs on them, but they weren't hieroglyphs. And apparently Napoleon had somebody with him that transcribed all of them. And those they don't know where the notebooks are, but of course there was an earthquake and the casings partially fell off, and then the Egyptian people used the casings to build their cities. So we've lost whatever was on the outside, but apparently, according to something Patrick found, that the limestone casings actually had writing of some sort on them that looked like hieroglyphics but weren't. And this man spent a couple of years copying it all down in notebooks, and the notebooks were preserved, but nobody knows where they are.
I've heard that's something we discussed while we were there, actually, with some of the Egyptologists we were with. And unfortunately, there's only one account of that. And I think this was quite late. This was like, as you mentioned, it could have been, I think it was a bit before Napoleon, in the sort of 1500, something like that. But
could be.
In the 8th century and in the 12th century, there are two different accounts of Arab people going there. One of them actually dug their way in and actually found a way in for the first time. And the casing stones were all still on, but there's no mention of any hieroglyphs on them or any carvings on them at all. And then a few hundred years later, someone said there were hieroglyphs on them. And so there's a bit of confusion about that. And all the ones that are still there and all the ones that are known have been moved. There's no hieroglyphs on them now. And so there's a little bit of confusion about that. But just the fact that, because you don't really get that with these three pyramids. There's no hieroglyphs originally with them, I don't think.
Yeah.
And as you said, there's no evidence of actual burials, although each of them has got sarcophagi in them, which is strange. They've got like these, what look like granite sarcophagi, where it looks like people should have been buried, but they weren't, so either looters took the bodies out if there were any. But certainly I don't think they would even if they were used as tombs, just to speculate, that wasn't the only purpose for them. There was clearly some other much higher purpose. And it could have been functional. It could have been practical. It could have been a technology, like a spiritual technology as well as a practical technology for the planet. Because there's one piece of evidence that they actually absorb seismic energy from the Earth to reduce earthquakes. That's one of the functions of pyramids. This is something that Chris Dunn mentioned in his book, I think. And obviously you have the kind of actual kind of wisdom and mathematics and geometry and all the secrets encoded within the structure itself. Once you decode it by just what is there, what you can see with your eyes, it's just astonishing.
Now, it's said, and I've looked on Google Earth, that the sides aren't actually straight, that they are curved in slightly, so that to prevent, so that it really isn't four-sided, it's more of an eight-sided pyramid, the Great Pyramid.
That is correct. Yeah, that is correct. There were some aerial photographs taken by the military around the time of the equinox, I believe, where they realised that was the case. So that would have been the case with the casing stones as well. It wouldn't have just been like what was left, which is like the sort of the inner kind of part of it. But yeah, and you can see that in the shadows. But the thing is, it only lasts for like just a fraction, like just a few seconds or a minute, where you actually witness that. So it's almost like a clock. It's like a sort of solar clock, which does that twice a year on the equinoxes. And so that is incredible in itself. So they could have been designed for that purpose, partly as a great celestial kind of clock. Looking at different time periods and recording that with the shadows and with the placement and with the way the light, with the polygonal walls, you have all these sort of, when you get certain light on them at certain times, you get this in the Valley Temple and on the two lesser pyramids. When the light hits at a certain angle at a certain time of year, you actually start seeing patterns and shapes emerging on them. You get this in Peru as well, on the polygonal walls there. So there's something about the shadow. You know, they're very into the shadows.
Well, yeah, that's similar to the it's in South America where the serpent the serpent stare. I know that the serpent shadow falls and you see a snake or stairs or something. I remember there was something with.
That's a Chichen Itza. That's
yeah.
That's in Central America, in the Yucatan Peninsula. That's one of the key pyramids there. So it's the pyramid there, I believe there on the equinox as well. Similar things happen where you have the shape of the sort of snake moving down the pyramid with the big snake heads that's carved in rock at the bottom, which kind of only emerge on the equinoxes. Yes, same kind of principle. So again, these pyramids were like celestial kind of clocks and solar clocks. And I think this is evident in many sites that people don't realise, even at Stonehenge, even stone circles as well. But this is something that the brilliant Terence Meaden has been working on. He's a professor, and he spoke at our conference last year, and he's going to actually speak at our conference next year in May, because he's brilliant. And he looks at like the shadow play of monoliths and the way they move around during the year, and how they have fertility symbolism encoded within the way they move, like phallic symbols and all this kind of stuff. So the same principles are at play. And I think, again, this harks back to the idea that the ancients were always working with what was available to them. So the movement, the only light they had was really from the sun and the stars, and fire. So they were like working with that. So any movements, they were working with that into whatever they were building. So they were working with the shadows, with the light. It was one of the most important aspects for them.
Well, and it often is said that, excuse me, that they were these were primitive cultures, and yet it feels as though they had architects that were geniuses, and you begin to reconsider about these were. Again, you come into, was it Atlantis stuff? Because it feels as though the technology that has been utilized, and especially with the stuff in Peru, you look at those stones and you know that they couldn't possibly have been cut. And even Egypt, come on, copper tools didn't carve those stones. I'm sorry, it just didn't. And so you wonder, where did the technology come from that helped them to put these rocks together so closely that you didn't need to have any sort of cement or anything like that. And yet, I think haven't they found that there was some sort of polymer of some sort that was between the stones in Egypt?
Well, that's the idea put forward by the engineer Joseph Davidovits, and he claims that all the stones on the pyramid, all 2.5 million of them, were created using, like ancient concrete and the limestone there. But the problem is, most of the stones are all slightly different shapes and sizes, so they would have had to create different shapes and sizes casts for all of them. And the problem is, you actually go to the quarries there, and you can see where they cut stones out, and then they used in the pyramids. So I'm not too sure about this casting the stones rather than carving and shaping them from quarrying, because there's a lot of evidence they did the classic quarrying and cutting and shaping. So there's a bit of a debate about that. There's no real cement was used that I'm aware of in ancient Egypt, especially the pre-dynastic stuff and the early dynastic stuff, like the pyramids. But you never know. You just don't know. There's such a high level of technology. They were working with all these different ways of working with stone.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and I keep getting drawn back to Puma Punka because those stones. I mean, I've seen the right edges. I've seen the carving and the carving, and it does make you wonder just what kind of an instrument created them. I mean, they almost look like Legos. And
they do, yeah. You get you have H blocks there, especially that they kind of have that look. But so much has been taken from Puma Punku and Tiwanaku that it's troublesome. It's difficult to decode anything from it. The only stones they haven't really taken are the largest ones they couldn't move, and so there's hardly anything left to work with. But what they're finding there is this high level of technology again, this sort of laser-like precision, which shouldn't be in Peru or Bolivia at any time. There's no evidence of that kind of high level of sophisticated technology, or certainly a culture that could have used that. So it's utterly bizarre. This is why the connection with Egypt fascinates me, because the same technology is in place there, the same quality of stonework, the same style, and the same precision. We even find, the same symbolism, the same, evidence of even, look at Thor Heyerdahl's work of like traveling across the seas. And they found South American cocaine in some of the mummies in Egypt and things like this. And so we know that there's definitely connections between these ancient cultures.
Oh, absolutely. And now I'm just curious, with Puma Punku, have they done any archaeological digging there, or are they just working with whatever was on the surface?
No, they're digging there. They've been digging there for a few years now. And it's actually, they employ the local Aymara people, the indigenous people of the area around Lake Titicaca, to do the digging. But they claim that it was their ancestors that built it, that they hold on to that claim. And so they're worried that whenever they find anything that suggests outside influence, they might not present that or publish that. So there's a bit of politics going on there, like we find with many other places. Like even Egypt is the same. They don't want any evidence they're not indigenous Egyptians that built these sites. And so, that's kind of a problem. But there is more research. So every time we go out there, we find more research has been done, more digging has been done. And they've realized that Puma Punku is a huge pyramid. It's a huge step pyramid that had a walk, that had a kind of like a jetty going into Lake Titicaca.
Oh,
much
wow.
like the Akapana pyramid at Tiwanaku, which is just the same site really. So it's just next to each other, but it's much bigger. It's a much bigger kind of step pyramid. It's quite a low pyramid. It's not like a pointy pyramid like we find at Giza or anything like that. But yeah, so it does suggest that it was a very major. It was almost like a palace. It would have looked amazing. I've seen some of the reconstructions, and it is remarkable what it would have looked like if everything was still there and hadn't been taken away.
And it was taken away by what, governments or museums or whatever?
Yeah, just local people. It's useful shaped and cut stones to build their homes with and churches with. I mean, you go to the church. Seriously, you go to the church in Tiwanaku Town Square. They've got two of these massive Atlantean statues outside the front, and you can just see the stones they've taken from Puma Punku and Tiwanaku and built into the church. It's unbelievable. You walk around the church, and it's like, oh man, you can just see what they've done. It's just terrible, and it's such a haphazard construction compared to what the original site would have looked like. It's a bit of a joke.
What do you think? I know you don't know, but what could have possibly happened at Puma Punku that could have disassembled whatever was there? I mean, obviously,
it looks like it just looks like. I mean, it's something Brian Forrester and I have been looking at for years. I've been going there since 2007. It looks like a cataclysm, like some kind of wave came from Lake Titicaca, and because they're both covered in mud and muck, they're totally covered. And now just realizing that there's actually another pyramid under Tiwanaku covered in mud, and they just started to dig that up now. It's bizarre. So and Puma Punku they thought was just a few stones on top and this area, but it was just what was luckily was preserved on top of the pyramid. And so, so that somehow they were covered in thousands of tons of mud. probably from the lake. Something happened, some kind of cataclysm, something hit the lake, an asteroid or something, or there was an earthquake and it caused a wave, through the area, or there was massive flooding and the lake flooded violently, something like that. I mean, but you find that evidence all around Lake Titicaca, all different sides of the lake, the Peruvian side as well. We have sites like Silastani, which are right next to another lake next to Lake Titicaca, which was originally the same part of the same lake, and the same thing. It looks like something's hit it from a certain side, from a certain angle. So it's probably the same thing.
I think there's a study that shows that a very large meteor did hit by the Yucatan Peninsula, and it hit.
That's right.
Hit in the water. Well, that may have caused something like that, but you get so curious as to, okay, I'm one of these that I want to see a timeline. I want to see when, these things were built and these things were built and these things were built. And so you can work on a timeline and understand the culture, the evolution, the de-evolution of what was going on. To have all of these amazing structures and not even have a chronicle of what came first, because it would make it so much more easy. I mean, it won't explain.
There is a basic chronology that is, the traditional archaeological viewpoint. I mean, there's a whole Tiwanaku, they believe, was built no earlier than 500 BC. That's the earliest dates that allow for that. Generally, they think it's like 100 AD onwards. However, there's a site called Chirapa, which is near there. It's just a bit past Lake Titicaca, the opposite, towards the lake from La Paz, which is an earlier site, which is like a sunken temple with megaliths. It's even still used today, interestingly. We're going to try and visit that on this trip we're doing next month. And that dates back to about, again, 500 or 400 BC. But we're not sure about this because there's evidence of agriculture on in the Andes Mountains and near Lake Titicaca that goes back 10,000 years. There's archaeological evidence, there's carbon dating of occupation there going back 10,000 years, and yet the sites don't seem to be that old according to the traditional dating. However, there was a chap called Arthur Poznański, I think he was a Polish American or Austrian American or something, back in the 1930s, I believe, who did archaeoastronomical investigations all over Tiwanaku and believed that he, through what he believed was the correct archaeoastronomy, dated it to 17,000 years ago. That was according to how it would have functioned as an astronomical temple back then. And so that puts it in a whole different perspective. But then you start looking at, the technology there as well. I mean, they were using very sophisticated stonework again, very sophisticated. They're these keystone cuts. They were creating molten metal alloys for like a bronze type material from 5 different metals, some of them that were imported from the other side of the Atlantic, to create these keystone cuts, to join these stones together. And they were definitely creating molten metal. And in that case, you've got to heat up the metal to, a very hot temperature, which was unknown until the last few hundred years. And so it's very bizarre the more you look into these sites, whether it's the Giza Plateau, whether it's Göbekli Tepe, or whether it's Pumapunku and Tiwanaku.
No, it's mind-boggling. And what's really fascinating is that especially when you're looking at South America, when you realize that only a small percentage has been uncovered from the jungle. That there are still sites there that haven't even been excavated or gone into. That there is so much more. I mean, you've got the ones that have been developed and have been cleaned up, and tourists go and walk in and everything. But there are sites there that haven't even been touched yet. Which surprises me, because with all of our ability with satellites and they can even utilize satellites to do radar that will take away the vegetation and show what's there. I suspect we know where there are other sites that could be of value, but for some reason they aren't being excavated at this point in time.
Well, yeah, as they've been clearing the Amazon of the rainforest for, which isn't a particularly good thing, they've actually been finding huge geometric earthworks and evidence of civilization going back thousands of years, all through the Amazon. It's quite bizarre. And so that suggests, there was a lot going on there for very, very ancient times. There's even evidence of giants there. There's evidence of red-haired, fair-skinned tribes. The Amazon women, obviously. There's all this kind of stuff going on there. They've even found a stone circle at the entrance to the Amazon from the Atlantic in Brazil, which we feature in the book, in the Americas spread. And so, yeah, the list goes on. And also, when I was in the Tiwanaku Museum, which is in La Paz, the capital, the area of Bolivia, there I found what appeared to be one of these Scottish geometric stone spheres, which was found near Lake Titicaca, which I was like, what the hell? Because I've been researching these spheres. I've written a big article about it for ancientorigins.net website. And I couldn't believe it when I was there and I actually spotted this one that was clearly, it just looked like it had come from Scotland. So there's a bit of research needs to be done here, but there are evidences of migrations out of Orkney to different parts of Europe at least. But if there's a connection with South America, that would kind of make sense in a strange way, because there are connections there. There are actually stone circles around Lake Titicaca, a place called Silistani, which I mentioned earlier, which seem to be astronomical as well. So, yeah, there's more research needs to be done on diffusionism and different, correlations with different cultures around the planet.
I really like the theory that there was at one time a global culture, because it makes sense to me that the similarities are just too many. That at some point in time there was a global culture, and that for whatever reason it was fragmented. I want to get back to the giants, though, because I'm glad you're doing another book on giants, by the way. I think the last one you did, The Giants on Record, with Jim, was fabulous. I absolutely thought it was an amazing book, and I'm so delighted the two of you are working, to take it further, because I think that again is another part of our history that needs to be recognized, because so many people just don't understand how very many there were. It was a large culture. It was a civilization of giants. It wasn't one or two. It was thousands of them. And I know here in the United States, I mean, just the records of those that were dug up, at least the ones that you can see if you do a quick search, I mean, thousands of them. And it feels almost as though they were here before those who became our Native Americans came across the land bridge. So and that's just my feeling, but it seems to me that the giants were here before those who became indigenous came into this area.
Yeah, there's a good case for that. Certainly, I mean, this land bridge thing is controversial nowadays because it seems like, but we don't know. There's still a lot of debate about that. But there's evidence of human occupation in North America going back 100,000 years now. There's certainly occupation going back 40,000 years on the Catalina Island and the islands of the coast of California. Even in New Jersey, they found a skull which was 100,000 years old, things like this. But the difference between North American giants and other giant cultures around the world is that in North America, there were like tribes. There was like a civilization of giants. It was serious. There was no messing about. It was like a major population, often of giants. It wasn't in England. It's a bit more sparse. They're not quite probably smaller tribes maybe and things like this, but North America was a whole different world, and they were around for thousands of years. There's evidence going back at least 10,000 years. There's evidence in the oral traditions that Deloria Jr. and others have put together, placing them at the time of the megafauna, which would have been 13,000 years ago, before the so-called Younger Dryas impact event would have happened. But there's no archaeological record to back that up, although there are. We do have the, spirit caveman. We have, evidence of, very ancient skeletons, which have been proven to be at least 10 to 12,000 years old in North America. And so, I'm intrigued by that. But you get the same, you get similar traditions in Mexico, going into Central and South America. In Peru, you get this in Bolivia with the whole story of Viracocha. He was like the great god of the Andes. He emerged from Lake Titicaca again onto the island of the sun, where there's actually a temple there called the Chicana Ruins, and he was said to have created some giants from the earth, and they became known as the stone giants, which are traditions we find in North America. And these stone giants created the megalithic sites like Tiwanaku, Pumapunku, Cuzco, Sacsayhuaman, and Machu Picchu, and so forth, along this what's called the straight line alignment called the Path of Viracocha. And then he had to destroy them with a flood to kill them and get rid of them because they became violent, aggressive, cannibalistic, and they became really bad people, basically. So then he had to recreate another race of humans, and this is the same story we find in the Bible. Basically, it's something that
right.
I'm sure Patrick looked at this kind of thing as well, where we have the Nephilim that were destroyed, that had to be destroyed by God, floods and this, that, and the other. After the Watchers and the human female women, bred them and created them. So we have the same kind of stories emerging in different parts of the world, often related to cataclysms and giants. So yes, it's quite bizarre the more you look into this. But I think that the giant thing, especially in North America, it needs to be looked at by academia. It really does. They need to just deal with it and accept it's probably a reality. They need to kind of take it on board, especially as the Smithsonian were involved in finding so many of the giants. And then they covered it up. It's really strange, isn't it? It's one of the most compelling stories I've ever heard of in my life, specifically North America, even though I'm not American or anything, but it's just unbelievable. It's like a whole part of human history completely eradicated from the historical record, but there's tons of evidence to suggest it was real. Amazing.
Oh, absolutely. And they don't even go into in the history books the copper mines in Minnesota and Michigan that have been utilized for the last 9,000 years, and they have records of it. So, they've carbon dated stuff. They know that that metal has turned up in Rome and all sorts of other places, and so it's kind of like, come on, give us a history that is. I think what has always upset me is when you talk about ancient history, everybody immediately goes to Rome, Greece, and Egypt, and the reality is North America has ancient history as well that goes back to those same time frames, or maybe even earlier. And just
I agree. I think you're on it. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think America is often overlooked when it comes to that, even by the academics who live in North America. It just needs to be addressed and taken seriously, because there's this theory which we postulate in the book, the Giants on Record book. We put in the final chapter. It's a little bit controversial, but it's been known since the 1980s, which was first really coined by I forget his name, Jeffrey Goodman, I think, is an archaeologist, and it's basically called American Genesis, and about how humans may have not originated in Africa, they may have originated on the American continent, and since then it's been developed into speciation has occurred on different continents around the world, not just Africa. And this puts a whole new timeline and a whole new perspective on things where, well, in that case, how did we just suddenly emerge in different parts of the planet? And then you look into the oral traditions, you look into good translations of like the Book of Enoch and the Book of the Giants and so forth. And it does seem like there's some kind of just emergence of humans on the planet at a certain epoch. It's very bizarre the more you look into this, especially when you look at the oral traditions. I think that's where the real nuggets of wisdom and truth are. And especially with the North American tradition, it seems to be like they really wanted to hold on to the exact wording of stories passed down from generation to generation. Precise, you couldn't change one syllable or one word. It had to be exactly the same because the words carried the power, it carried the truth, and you couldn't mess with it. And those that knew how to understand it properly would get the full story. And so, yeah, I'm sort of waffling a little bit myself now, but anyway.
No, I know it's. You sit back and you look at it and you logically sit back and you just let it sink in and you realize something is wrong here. and you know, we have Monk's Mound, and that's very, very old, and we've so many mounds we've destroyed, and it's I know in some of them they found pearls and they found gold and they found coral, and you know they have found I think there was a giant someplace that was surrounded by seed pearls. I mean, just surrounded by it, so that there is a richness here and a culture that we absolutely don't have a connection to, and we should. And then of course you've got the red-haired giants in I forget, the Paiutes in Nevada, the red-haired giants, their story about how they wiped them out by putting them into a cave and setting fire in front of the cave to kill them. And while that was a legend for a long time, when they went in and started to mine the guano, they found the arrow points and then they found the bones. And of course the bones were sent to the Smithsonian. So do you have any knowledge of or an opinion of the cave that theoretically was found on Kincaid's Cave in Colorado? I think the cave where it is a story that was reported in the newspapers, and apparently he was on a job from the Smithsonian. He found this cave that had Indian statues and it had mummies in it and it had Egyptian artifacts. And the theory, the story goes that David Hatcher tried to find information and he was totally shut down. And the area where that cave supposedly is in the Grand Canyon has been, you can't even fly over it with airplanes anymore or helicopters.
I've heard something about it. I spoke to David about this actually a while back. I think this was the so-called the Egyptian artifacts that were found in the Grand Canyon, reported originally in 1909, I believe, or 1905.
Yeah, Kincaid's Cave.
Yeah, there's not been able to find anything more from that. People have tried to find that, obviously, but it's out of bounds for starters. And interestingly, a lot of the name places of that part of the Grand Canyon have Egyptian names.
Yes.
If you just Google it, you can find that it's quite weird that you can actually find all the names are given specific Egyptian names. Hang on a second, why would they do that? So no, I don't know. I'm not too sure about that. I think someone needs to go there. I mean, it may have been completely looted. It could have collapsed. You just don't know. You know, no idea what really could have happened there.
Yeah, it just from what reading I did, you know, the caves themselves would have held like 20,000 people, and the level of the Colorado was probably up to wherever the opening of the cave was when whatever it was created. So yeah, a lot of speculation. I mean, and you know, you leave it to our imaginations and we can weave all sorts of stories about it. But I mean, we've got enough conspiracy going on already that we don't need more. But it just it does boggled the mind, and the newspaper reports appear to be, unfortunately, they appeared on April Fool's Day. So, you wonder, was it just some great big joke? But I don't think so. And with all of the other stuff going on with the giants, with all of the discoveries, with all of the things that we have not had access to do something like that, I think the reason they stopped the airplanes and helicopters from going in that particular area is because they said the condors were nesting there. But that's a bunch of phooey. I don't buy it for a minute. So I think the American public, the humanity as a whole is so much more aware and so much more intelligent and insightful these days, so that you can't give us those stupid stories and expect we're going to say, oh, okay, and walk away. We're way too curious, and happily there are people like you around. We have a few minutes left. You want to talk a little bit about the upcoming Megalithomania conference, where it's going to be and who's going to be there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The next Megalithomania is actually before Megalithomania, just in the next week or so, on November the 4th, myself and Andrew Collins organised the Origins Conference in London. And actually, speaking of extreme antiquity, we have Michael Crimo, who's going to be discussing his work on forbidden archaeology. And Andrew and myself are speaking there. Jim Vieira's coming over as well, amongst others. And then we do our big Megalithomania conference every May. Next year, it's May the 12th, 13th. We've got a whole plethora of speakers and researchers coming from all over the world. We also get private access to Stonehenge on the Friday before the conference, and we do like 3 extra days of tours after the conference. So people want to come over for like a week and hang out in Glastonbury, the hippie town central of Britain, and they're very welcome. People can just check out megalithomania.co.uk or hughNewman.co.uk. It's a bunch of stuff there. We're also doing tours. We've got a big tour to Peru, which is completely full now, unfortunately. So that's it. We do that every November. We're going to Mexico, actually, Olmec and Mayan, Mexico in January. Me and Brian Forrester and Jim Vieira are going to be running a tour there. People can join us for that. We've got a whole bunch of other stuff going on all next year, so people can take a look and get in touch.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm just so fortunate to have met you when you did Megalithomania here in Connecticut, and I'm so very grateful that you took the time to do a show today with me, because it's you are connected so much to everything that warms my heart that it's just a delight to be able to get you on the radio.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure, Barbara. Very, very, very happy to come on and just have a chat with you as well, really. It's been a while.
It has been. It was 2011 when we did Secrets of the Stones, and that sent me on not only the stone fascination but the giants as well, which continues to, both of them continue to be something that absolutely draw my attention, and keep raising questions as to, okay, what is our real history and where did we really come from? And, not that we'll get all the answers, but every now and then we get a grain of truth that plants a seed of wisdom in humanity, which is so encouraging. So I thank you again for being here. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule. And I will try real hard to get you on again in a 6 months to a year's time frame to see if we can catch up with you again.
Sounds great, Barbara. Thanks very much.
You're very, very welcome, and thank you for being here. And thank you for everybody for tuning in. I so appreciate your time, and hopefully we have raised some questions that will send you on a journey of research, hopefully, and greater understanding as to the culture and the magic that is held within the stones and what is yet buried beneath the ground that can enlighten us to a future that hopefully will be even lighter. Good night now. Good afternoon, actually, or wherever you are. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye now.